Kim Rosen, MFA, is the author of Saved by a Poem, The Transformative Power of Words, Hay House, 2009, and the founder, director of the Safe House, Fund, Safe House Education Fund. She has awakened listeners around the world to the power of poetry to heal and transform individuals and communities. Kim combines her devotion to poetry with her background in psychotherapy and spirituality to offer workshops, retreats, and poetry concerts throughout the world. In 2010, she founded the Safe House Education Fund to give Maasai girls who have fled female genital mutilation, hard to say, hard to think about,
Yes.
and early childhood marriage, an opportunity to go to college and transform the oppression of women in their families, their tribe, and the world. A graduate of Yale University and Sarah Lawrence College, Kim is co-creator of 4 CDs of poetry and music, a TEDx speaker, and her writing has been published in the Sun magazine, O magazine, and Spirituality and Health, among others. Wow. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you so much. It's interesting just to hear that read. I'm going, is that me? I like that life, which is, a wonderful feeling.
Yeah, to look at what you've built and what you've created and what has moved you forward and what has brought you to this moment here.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about what is alive for you right now with all that we are faced with in the world.
Yeah, it's something, one of the things I'm thinking about a lot is the life stage that each of us is at anyway, pandemic or no pandemic, and how that life stage, that the tasks, the arising, who knows whether it arises from spirit or soul or biology even, but each stage of life has a somewhat different task. So the fact that this pandemic, for me personally, just to speak personally, has come at a time when I was just on the verge of starting to let go of moving, being very focused on moving out into the world and much more focused on teaching others to pick up what I've created and support them to carry it into the world. That's been my thrill most recently, even though, my super thrill is speaking poetry on stage with fantastic musicians. That is always, and may be until my deathbed, my favorite of favorite things to do. But that aside, what I'm thrilled at is that there are students of mine who have picked up and started weaving the work that I offer into their work. I was never very interested in people offering the work that I offer as I offer it. I was very interested in supporting people who came to work with me for years in what I have called my mystery school. I was very interested in supporting them to infuse whatever their note was to sing in the universe, to infuse it with whatever they could take from me. And it's happening, and that's thrilling. It's a wonderful thing. And also with the She Fund, my staff is amazing now, and they're all like, 29, 30 years old. And they're on fire with the mission of sending these girls to school. And they're all, in the United States, staff is all artistic creatives who happen to know how to make spreadsheets, which is just a mystery to me how those two things come together. So that's what's thrilling. And so to get to the point, the pandemic came into my life at a point where I was almost ready to retire myself. But it wasn't my timing. And so there is the kind of systemic shock. But wait a second, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean, you know, now, and I didn't mean it happening out of the great mystery of things. I meant that I was going to do it. So I feel that for me, it's different than, say, for someone who is in their 20s and 30s, or even their 50s, working at a different stage of one's relationship, especially as an artist, one's relationship to moving what one has to give and how one's called to serve into the world. So I am deeply disoriented. And not in ways I expected. Meaning every time I have to cancel another workshop. I just canceled my Irish retreats, which were supposed to happen in early September. You know, it's a heartbreak and an identity crisis. But what's coming in is a tremendous receptivity and even demand for the work that I'm offering online, which wasn't in my plans, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can I tell a small story?
Please.
You might have seen this because I rarely post these personal things on Facebook, but I did post this story. I think you might have even written a comment. When we first caught wind that the pandemic was coming and that there might be a lockdown, I remember going to Good Earth, which is our local health food store. It's an amazing place where I often see Pollyanna. And I was in Good Earth. It was before we were confined to our homes. And there were so many people rushing around, people that usually Good Earth, everybody's really friendly, everybody stops to talk. They're rushing around with these driven, rodent looks on their faces, piling their carts high with toilet paper and frozen foods and amazing things. And I followed suit and I was going around and I was putting things like frozen rabbit in my shopping cart. It's never even occurred to me to eat frozen rabbit, but that was all that was left in the frozen meat department. And so I'm putting these things, I would never frozen broccoli in my cart. And I just said, wait a second, I can't do this. Not that there was anything wrong, and those people had a lot of foresight that I didn't have, but I almost in a ritual way, I went back and I put everything back on the shelves. And I said, I'm going to trust that I can have a different relationship to whatever's coming. And I went outside and I had this insight that I have been working with Zoom before anyone had ever heard of it. I had been working with how do you bring poetry and music and movement and whole body, mind, heart, spirit experiences into this format because most of my students are in Ireland or Wales or Canada. So I thought, I've been doing this forever. I'm going to give free Zoom workshops. That's what I can offer. What can I do? I can't take care of people's kids. I'm terrible with kids. You know, what do I have to offer? And so I started to do free Zoom events, which to my truly great surprise, have been incredibly rewarding and lush and popular. Mm-hmm. And I started giving workshops for people who wanted to give Zoom events on how they could use the platform. So that's my story of the pandemic and how it sort of swept me.
Yeah, and what a beautiful story, sharing that. I'm sure that a lot of our listeners right now can certainly relate to that. And it really, what you're doing is you're really modeling that, the practice of, wait, hold on, stop.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, what is really needed here, and following your own guidance. And goodness gracious,
Mm-hmm.
that's what being a creative being is, as far as I can tell, as far as I have been able to experience in my life, is that listening, that
Mm-hmm.
what is the true expression here.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. That listening and that honoring what for so many of us in the Western world was not necessarily the direction our parents wanted us to head. And so, in that moment, coming out onto the street, leaving good earth empty handed, and thinking that the news is telling me um, what we need is childcare for the frontline workers. What we need, if you want to give, what you can do is you can go volunteer at the local food bank. And I think all of that is very important. And me saying, gosh, I'm terrible at those things.
Mm.
Um, what have I been training my whole life to give in this moment? And can I honor the value of this particular unique set of experiences encrypted into this voice and this human as its own food bank that people can come to?
I love it. I love it. You're a food bank. You're the beautiful poetess, priestess, magical, mystical, molecule changing,
Hmm.
nourishing food bank, a
May it
soul
be so.
nourishment. Yeah.
May it be so. Yeah.
And I would love to hear when you talked about like what has brought you to this moment, right? And
Mhm.
I'd love to share a bit of your journey, and challenges going into where you are right now, into this
Mm.
full expression that you are.
Isn't it a relief to be grown up?
Yes, it
I
is.
mean, yes and no. I don't want to paint it all pink and easy because anyone who knows me even slightly knows that one of my attributes is being fraught most of the time. Um, but my cousin, my uncle died a few weeks ago, and my cousin was going through the photographs, and he sent me this horrific photograph of me. I must have been 8, 9 years old
Mm.
with my mother. I had a white hair bow and a petticoat and little Mary Jane shoes and a white dress that was so tight, and my hair was slicked back because I had very curly hair as a child. And I was so stiff. I looked like, a 19th century photograph.
Mm.
And I thought, oh my gosh, how hard it was to try to fit in, you know. What an agony that was. Um, that I know I'm not alone, that I suspect so many of us who follow the artist's call um, had to step out again and again from any hope of being what you fill in the blank, mother, family, culture, Western world wanted us to be, or what we thought. Um, there's a great poem about that, if I may. It's by Rilke, and it's one of the few poems that I translated because I fell so deeply in love with this poem. And it's not that I speak German, but there is Google Translate. And I have, it turns out, many German friends who are lovers of Rilke's work. And so it was a group effort. It's called The Departure of the Prodigal Son. And it's worth just taking a moment to remember what the story of the prodigal son is, and that at a certain point he went off because he had to separate from his father, alias his father in heaven. Now to walk away from all this entanglement that is ours and yet does not belong to us. That hooks us again and again like thorns, that like water in a deep well reflects us trembling, distorts our image. To walk away from this and that we long ago stopped seeing, so familiar, so commonplace were they. And then to look back once, tender, forgiving, as if for the first time, so fresh, to realize at last how impersonal is the suffering that comes to each of us, that fills childhood to the brim. And then to walk away, rending hand from hand as if to reopen a wound, and walk away. Where? Into the unknown, into a warm and unfamiliar place that whatever happens remains indifferent, like a backdrop, a garden, or a wall, and walk away. Why? Zeal, mission, dark expectation from not being known, from not knowing. To take on all this, to let go all hope, to let fall whatever you may still be holding on to, perhaps to die alone, not knowing why. Is this the opening to the new life?
Yeah.
It's a fierce poem, right?
It is a fierce poem.
But it really, every time we walk away from something that we think we were supposed to be in order to get, to use Byron Katie's phrase, love, approval, or appreciation, you know, every time we walk away, there has to, what's hard about it is that on some archetypal level, it requires the willingness to die alone, right?
Yes.
You know, not to like over dramatize it like, oh, you're gonna die or like that, but it simply does require that, you know?
Yes. It requires a lot of courage and will.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So would you say that, that sort of paints the color, the feeling? I mean, I'm getting that in terms of your path and finding that way. It was incredibly challenging, as for most of us, I would say it is. And also it's a bit of a crucible, isn't it? That
Yes, totally. Isn't it? Isn't it? You know, I can't believe I'm thinking of this, but here it is. I remember being at a retreat center that used to be in upstate New York called Elat Chaim. It was a Jewish retreat center, but it wasn't just for Jewish people. But there happened that the great Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi was teaching that week. And I remember him saying to me, friction is necessary. In terms of your statement about the crucible, friction is necessary. Have you ever tried to make love without friction?
wow.
You know?
Yeah, it's I think I was in the Diamond Heart work for a long time, and they talk about the real, becoming the true person,
Mm-hmm.
and that they call that the pearl, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you have that, all the challenges and all that friction of life,
Mm-hmm.
working on your soul,
Mm-hmm.
but
Yes.
then that infused with the awakening of who you truly are, it gives it the colors of the
Yeah.
pearl, and that you have all those qualities, and then you wouldn't have them, you wouldn't have that personal you-ness to
Mm-hmm.
connect with in the world without that friction.
And we hear this, or I've heard it through my whole life, really, um, that it makes us who we are. But as you say that, Pollyanna, I'm just thinking of you as an artist and your songs and any artist I know, and you can really see the agonies and the ecstasies encrypted literally into their voice, into their body, into the way those notes go together and come out for me, into my voice, into the poems that I choose. And each of us, I used to call it, I used to call it our resonant distortion. And by that, I mean that each of us has the grit of our humanness that is encrypted into what we transmit into the world, whatever our art is. And that grit is as important as the grace that we communicate, because there are people who could not receive the grace if that particular grit wasn't there, And then another person needs a different grit,
Yeah,
right? But people are as attracted to our distortion as they are to our transmission of grace,
yeah.
right?
Mhm.
And so, I hear that as you speak that truth, how it makes us, it hones us into
It,
what we are.
yeah, exactly. And you know, when you get to these places and you look back, it's that you would not trade one moment, right?
Yeah,
When
but
you,
I wouldn't want to do it again.
not that you want to do it again, and
Right?
it brought you to where you are.
Yes, yes.
And I love that, the grit and the grace. I think
Hmm.
maybe I'm gonna write a song, right?
Do that. You'll be borrowing it from Ken Wilber, who wrote the
Oh,
famous book called Grace and Grit.
okay, well, I'll reverse it and then we'll
Yeah.
be. So actually, it kind of brings me to something that you said that really struck me when you and I were talking about a week ago. And I was talking about, the title of my summit, the empowered artist, and I think of you as that. And then I said something like, what guidance can you offer, to folks, to our listeners here, uh, in terms of, becoming an empowered artist? What is that, unleashing your creative genius, and so to spoke. So you said something like, um, I hear it's really a question of the art and craft of surrender, that you have never felt empowered, rather that what you had to work on is disempowering your ego that thinks
Mhm,
it knows.
mhm,
Woo!
mhm. Yeah.
Talk
Yeah,
about,
that has been my work. Really, really. It's
yeah,
been my,
please speak more about that. Speak into that a little bit more.
yeah. Um, there's a great short poem and a long poem that come to mind. The short poem is by D.H. Lawrence and it's called Escape. And he says, when we get out of the glass bottles of our egos and escape, turning like squirrels in the cages of our personalities, and get into the forests again, we shall shiver with cold and with fright, but things will happen to us so that we don't know ourselves. Cool, unlying life will rush in, and passion will make our bodies taut with power. We shall stamp our feet with new power, and old things will fall down. We shall laugh, and institutions will curl up like burned paper. Right? When we get out of the glass bottles of our egos and escape, turning like squirrels in the cages of our personalities. So for me, there's just so much in that. I mean, the word ego is used in so many ways, and not all of them are a negative thing. But the ego can be a very necessary thing for moving us around life and for getting us to the edge, but it can't jump us off the edge. At that point, I like to say poetry uses the mind to unlock the mind. And that, to me, is what power is for. That the power I need is the power to surrender to what's being called from me, whether it was in the plan of my personality or not. And, for instance, right now, I didn't plan to be dedicating myself as to how to make alchemical vessels of transformation on Zoom. But here I am dedicating myself to doing that to the best of my ability. Yeah. I thought I was going to be in Greece right now. I mean, everybody thought. If everybody who's listening, think of where you thought you were going to be right now, and you'll learn about your capacity to surrender, right? Now, this surrender has been apparently enforced upon us, but it's still practice. Do you know? Rilke says, what we choose to fight is so small, and what fights with us is so great. If only we could allow ourselves to be dominated as things do by some immense storm, we would grow stronger too and not need names. When we win, it is with small things, and the triumph itself makes us small. What is extraordinary and eternal does not want to be bent by us. I mean the angel that appeared to the wrestlers in the Old Testament. When the wrestlers' sinews had grown strong as metal strings, he pressed them under his fingers like chords of deep music. Whoever was beaten by that angel, and he often simply declined the fight, went away proud and strengthened and great from that harsh hand that kneaded him as if to change his shape. Winning does not tempt that one. This is how she grows, by being defeated decisively by constantly greater beings. Winning does not tempt that one. This is how she grows, by being defeated decisively by constantly greater beings. That's another Rilke. Rilke seems to want to be.
What was the title of that one? I got to write that down.
That one is strangely called The Man Watching. And it begins, I jumped in the middle of it. Yeah, whoever was beaten by that angel, and she often simply declined the fight, went away proud and strengthened and great from that harsh hand that kneaded her as if to change her shape.
Yeah. And I think that is so important for people to hear. It's important for me to hear, for you to hear, for our listeners to hear. I think that so much around perfectionism and get it right. And you and I talked about that before we started the recording today. that is stopping us, right? That paralysis, like, oh, I'm not going to get it right. I'm not going to win. Well, you're right. You know, at one time, I'm just going to tell a quick story, even though I'm the interviewer. When I was in the recording studio and I was working on some vocals, I was starting to work on the vocals of my album Dying to Be Born. And I was just, you know, like hating it all. And I just lying on the floor, literally crying, saying, I'm never going to get there. I'm never going to get there. And then all of a sudden it went, I'm never going to get there.
Right.
And then I just stood up. Because
Yeah.
there's that truth, right?
Yeah.
And I think that for our creative genius to let itself be, to feel that flow.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You need to know that. And
absolutely.
which brings me to this question. I feel like I could talk to you for hours and hours. I'm so curious. Saved by a poem. And every time you bring these poems out from your heart and they're just so much a part of you, I feel saved. And I remember you doing readings back in the day when your book first came out, and I remember reading your book, and I know you have this beautiful practice way yourself of learning the poem by heart and teaching people how to do that. Will you share a little bit about that process?
Sure. That's, in a way, that's what the book Saved by a Poem is about. But I like to think it's also about more than that. But for me, the process of learning poems by heart was inspired by the poet David Whyte. I was, it was, another miracle where he showed up in my life in a totally crazy way. A client happened to leave an unmarked cassette tape. It must have fallen out of her purse. It got knocked under a radiator in my waiting room. It was probably there for a really long time because when I finally cleaned under the radiator, this cassette tape came out, and it came out at a time when I was, I always feel like whatever dark time arrives, it's the darkest. Do you have that feeling like but I think this may have been certainly one of the darkest periods of my life. I had no interest in living. I was probably as close to being suicidal as I've ever been. And so I dusted off this tape. It's not marked. It's covered with cat hair and globs of dust. I dusted it off, threw it in the cassette tape recorder, and this man's voice reciting poetry comes out, and he's reciting poetry to music. I didn't know who it was. There was no sign of who it was. All I knew was, you don't get so many really clear, undeniable signals, but I was completely slain. I was slain. I think I experienced that it was possible to embody spirit as I listened to him. And I think that my despair was largely that I did not believe that what I knew to be true could ever be conveyed. And so eventually I found out it was some guy named David Whyte. I looked him up in the phone book. I called the number and he picked up. Right? That would never happen now. But he picks up. We have a great conversation. I arranged for him to come across the country and give a workshop where I live. And the rest is history. And because of his teachings and his inspiration, I started learning poems by heart at that time, really as a lifeline. I didn't know that what it would do would be to, you probably know this when you sing, it literally, it almost feels like it reorganizes the electronics of my being, the electrical impulses of my being. And, in fact, the Buddhist, the very early Buddhists used to learn the Buddha's sayings and teachings by heart because they did not know how to write. So they would learn them by heart, and they were completely aware that it was rewiring them from the inside out. It was literally having a psycho, spiritual, physical effect from the inside out. And so that's what started to happen for me. And I started to learn more and more poems by heart, never expecting I would speak them. And then fast forward a bunch of years, and I came upon Jamie Sieber's work, and I knew I had to work with her. And I luckily knew someone. We had someone in common, a filmmaker. I called her up and I begged her, and she agreed to do a concert with me. And we got Michelle Gerlitz, a local percussionist, to join us. And it was at Open Secret. And I was unstoppable in a really embarrassing way when I look back now. I did not stop speaking for 4 hours. I had been waiting for so long. I had all these poems that were waiting to come out. And Jamie and Michelle are improvising. And finally, after about 2.5 hours, they said, "Can we take a break?" Michelle's fingers were raw. But that concert was 4 hours long. Gary Malkin had not yet trained me to allow the music to come in as a medicine to help people metabolize the poetry. And so it was 4 hours of all the poems I was passionately in love with. And that was the beginning of my love affair of speaking poems to music. I had done it before that, but working with Jamie has been a gift. And that was in 2001. And now we're old, but we're still doing it.
Well, you aren't old. You're just getting better and better. And yes, and you must all listeners, please, please, please get the recordings with Jamie Sieber, Kim Rosen, and again, life-changing work, really.
Thank you.
And couple of more things. One, I want to know what you would say to someone who's holding back their creative genius, their spark. Because we need to birth ourselves here. And I think there are probably people listening going, well, I'm not creative, or I don't do poems, or I don't fill in the blank. Right?
Yeah, I have been known to feel that way about somebody trying to hand me a paintbrush or give me a line to sing. Yes, so I'm sure there are many answers to that, but my response to that may be a bit of a surprise. My favorite section of Saved by a Poem is a short section called 2 Keys to Authenticity. It could say 2 keys to spontaneity, or it could say 2 keys to creativity. It would be the same thing. And it doesn't say the 2 keys to authenticity, because I'm sure there's myriad keys. But for me, these are the 2 keys to creativity, to spontaneous creative expression. And the 2 keys, I'm going to tell you what they are. The 2 keys, the first is the willingness to be seen, but not as you want to be seen, but in all your facets, even the aspects of yourself you have not yet seen or are in denial or suppression about. Right? So you know how when Barack Obama gets elected president, he's all good. He's like the saint. He's the, and he sort of looks that way now, but we don't have to go there. But after a while, when he's been president for a while, you're seeing this really upsetting thing about him and that other really upsetting. And you saw that look he gave to Michelle, when he thought the camera was off him. And, you see, and if you're going to be visible, you're going to be visible. And so the way I work with people is that I try to sense in with them to what aspects of themselves they're hiding. And I take people through processes of inquiring into what they're hiding. And then in a welcoming environment, I invite them to bring it out, whether that be playfully, it may be play acting, it may be very serious, it may be a rage that has not been expressed since your father died when you were 5. You know, it may be, the woman in boots and a whip who wants all of her lovers on their knees. It may be, the part of you that's full of needs and loneliness that you don't want to have seen. So the key is to voluntarily look towards what am I hiding, and then become intimate with that exact aspect of yourself. Because truly, when you become intimate with any aspect of yourself, and I mean really intimate, you don't have to love it. You don't, I'm not saying love yourself, because that's not a commandment we can obey, but we can get to know it more and more and more. And then love is a natural outgrowth. Acceptance comes naturally as we get to know these aspects of ourselves. First, we have to get to know that these aspects exist, and then we have to bring them out, usually in the witness of a compassionate other. And the second key to authenticity is, do you remember what the first one was? Be willing to be seen, but not as you want to be seen, but as you are in all your aspects. The second is be willing to be unseen, misunderstood, and unheard. And for many of us, myself certainly, that is the hardest mission. The willingness to free my audience to not get me, not receive me, not see me, not understand me, completely miss me, to let people have their own experience, whether it has anything to do with the experience I want them to have or not. And for me to be willing to welcome into my own feelings, not to muscle over it, but to feel, wow, they really didn't get it. Wow. Do you know what I mean? That's how I wrote my book. It took me years to write that book. But once I realized that every great writer that I knew had been totally misconstrued, totally unseen, totally like wrongly portrayed in the press, and that they had to be willing for that to happen in order to put their voice out, then I realized that was my work.
Yeah. And then you're free, right?
Yeah. Well, then
But
it can come out. Then whatever.
there's nothing else to protect. And
Yeah.
then there's nothing else to protect.
Yeah. For me, that's
You
the
don't-
case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the thing, is that we're so trained
Mm-hmm.
towards getting it right, towards being right, towards looking right, towards please mommy, please daddy, please whoever.
Mm-hmm.
And when we strip all that away, it's like, hey, here I am.
Mm-hmm.
Here I am to me, like, let me see who I am to me first, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
And then be willing to be who you are in the face of,
Right.
and then, wow.
I remember just a quick story. I remember in my second, I think it was the second concert I did with Jamie and Michelle, and it was not what you would call a successful concert. After the break, which we stopped having breaks in the middle after this, I think, after the break, only about half the audience came back. And I could tell it wasn't, but I had gotten this sequined top. It was a sequined, tight-fitting top. And I was wearing it. And after the concert, a friend came up and said, I have never seen that part of you. You looked like some kind of prima donna. You looked like you were acting like some kind of egomaniac rock star up there. And I thought, wow, is my nightmare. Thank you so much. That is so totally what I am all about not being, right? But, it did take me really a few years to stop wincing when I thought of it, but it really was a gift. This is exactly what I don't want to have happen. Can I open to that too? Right?
Yeah. It makes me think of, do you know of Matt Kahn? Do you know his work?
Yes, but not well, but I do know who he is. Yeah.
The thing for me that his biggest gift is that how, that everything is here to help you. And that's pretty radical, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
For me, that's what you're saying is thank you.
Mm.
And it's helping you to get to be with that thing, the worst possible thing that maybe you think is going to tear you apart and ruin you. And it didn't.
Right, right.
It made you stronger.
Yeah, yeah. And a thing in this case that I've shaped my whole life around not being,
Yes.
you know?
Yeah. I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
Can you just briefly touch on she? I mean, if you
Uh-huh.
could briefly touch on it, because we're coming to the end of our time. And I think it's very, very important for people to know
Mhm.
about this work that you do.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'd love to. And talk about Saved by a Poem, the ignition of what several years later became the She Fund, the Safe House Education Fund, happened because of a poem, because of what a poem can do. And it's not something that I've touched on in this interview, but it's not only what speaking and learning and loving a poem can do for you. And you don't have to learn it. If you're phobic about learning stuff, don't worry about it. You don't have to learn it. You can still have it be your beloved, whether you know it by heart or not. But as soon as you speak a poem to someone else, it's like the elevator went warp 5 down to the sub basement of your beings. And all of a sudden, you are in soul time with that person, even if you're in line at the grocery store, and you speak a poem, boom, you're in intimacy. And so what happened, just too briefly, is that I had the great honor for many years of my life that my close friend was a woman named Eve Ensler, who most people know as the woman who wrote the Vagina Monologue. And for me, she was my first friend at college when I was 16 years old. And for many years, I had the good fortune of being quite close to her. But my life was very different. My path, my calling was very different. And yet I would hear about what she was doing in the world with her organization that grew out of the Vagina Monologues called V-Day, which is a worldwide mission to stop violence against women and girls. And one of the things V-Day did was start this safe house in Kenya. And so I decided it was time for me to get out of my little upper middle class box and kind of crack open how frightened I was to be out in the world. So I took myself to Kenya. I took myself to the safe house. And as a child, I was pathologically shy. And I use that word in an informed way. I was sent to therapists by parents who didn't believe in psychology because they didn't know what else to do, because I was so shy and so afraid of talking to people. And so I went in part to break out of the shyness, but when I got to the safe house, 50 girls live there. They've all run away from or been rescued from female genital mutilation and early childhood marriage, which are practices in the Maasai tribe. So in rural Maasai, not in all Maasai, but among the very poor. It's to some extent it's a function of poverty. And I could go on about this, but I don't need to. You can go to our website and find out about it. I find it fascinating. But these girls have been rescued from having their clitorises cut and then being married off at the age of 12, 13, 14, 15 to a man who's 45, 50, 55, because this man has lots of cows and her parents can't feed the children. And the man will give 15 cows for the girl to be his wife, right? And so the children will be fed. And so it's not simple misogyny, although that's certainly a part of it. So these girls have been rescued and they live at the safe house. And there's about 50 of them. And I'm there. I'm getting introduced to 50 girls all at once. I'm terrified of teenagers, even the ones that live in Fairfax, California, much less teenagers that I don't know from such a different culture. And I couldn't talk. And so I said, can I recite a poem? And they said yes. And I thought, I don't know a poem that these girls could relate to, because my poems are all about inner growth and, spirituality. And what could these girls relate to? And all of a sudden I thought of Mary Oliver's poem, The Journey. And I'll just say it here. Is that all right? It's about 2.5 minutes long. Yeah. So the journey, which is, you will recognize yourself in it. But I also want you to hold that I'm saying this to 50 girls who have had to run away from everything they ever knew at the age of 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. One day you finally knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried. But you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, and though their melancholy was terrible. It was already late and a wild night, and the road was full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice, which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. Right? So by the end of this poem, all the girls are in tears. And I'm in tears. And they throw their arms around me. And this tall girl says to me, "Who is this woman, Mary Oliver? Is she Maasai?" And I said, "No, she's a Mzungu, a white person like me." How did she know? And, so the seeds of the She Fund are that tall girl who asked me that, it was a girl named Jacinta, who is now running the fund. She was the first girl that I put through college because I got a desperate note from her several years later saying that she hadn't gotten good enough grades to get any kind of scholarship, and she was going to have to go back to her village, get married off, and have to have all these children, which is what every woman before her in her entire lineage had done. She said, "Can you help me?" And so I asked my friends for money, and we were together. We were able to raise enough money, which in those days was only $2,000 for an entire year of college. And eventually, years later, she graduated with a degree in business, and she took over running the She Fund in
And I
Kenya.
just want to thank my listeners, our listeners today, for tuning in. Thank you so much for being here. I look forward, actually, I should just say, I have performed with Kim. We've done music together, Mimi music and her doing her poetry. And it's just,
Yes, I love doing that with you.
yeah, one of the experiences that I will always, always keep close to my heart. So thank you, everybody, and be well.
Thank you.